was a good opening question for the panel.
Thank you very much. So I think you've already alluded to some of this, so it may not be, like you said, for everyone to answer, but I asked if each of the panel members could give an example of a success and a failure that they have encountered in mainstreaming or implementing the concept of ecosystem services in their various work contexts. So I think it's really important that we share our failures as well as our successes with this so that we can learn from those.
I don't
go first.
Yeah. I sort of asked a very similar question to one of our members this afternoon before I was doing some prep for this one. So again, just sort of linking back, we've got this environmental sector strategy and we've got these key themes, and we as the membership see the environment as non-competitive. And an example in one of our companies where I think it sort of shows the benefits or the balance of natural capital is, for whiskey we need to utilise barley, that's our core material, so I suppose we're therefore consuming some natural capital there. But at the same time we're now moving towards using our byproducts, which is the material at the end of the process, to produce renewable energy. And this renewable energy is going to be on site, and that replaces heavy fuel oil, so that's a positive service. And on top of that, the digestate from this AD plant can go back to land banks and be a fertiliser, so kind of having that whole kind of circular economy loop. And with the AD plant, you're treating this material and utilising it in different ways, so the effluent that goes out from the distillery will change, and the water quality will improve, and you'll increase the capacity of the water environment again. So there's a kind of example that we think broadly sort of taking that environmental system services concept on.
Perhaps an example of where it didn't work, or a failure of the concept.
You've got to take it first.
I'll talk about it. Oh, no, go
ahead.
Somebody.
Okay, so in SEPA, we have in the past worked a lot on trying to embed the ecosystem services concept in lots and lots of different work areas, but we have failed quite regularly because it overcomplicates decision making and it doesn't result in better decisions. To be honest, quite often the decisions that we make are pretty good anyway, and we've tried to embed ecosystem services considerations, for example, in our consideration of SEAs, strategic environmental assessment processes, and really we have found internally that it tends to overcomplicate a system that people are already very familiar with and that works reasonably well already. I'm not saying it's perfect, but quite often using ecosystem services is a bit over the top in practical decision making in SEPA.
Well, so many successes, so few failures. But I think the world is complicated, and I think that's one of the reasons we need to acknowledge that, I think, in many circumstances, and also our uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future. So I think that's one problem. We think our policies are really the answer to the problem and not just an experiment that we're doing with the system. So in general, I think we need to acknowledge that we're taking a much more adaptive management approach. I'm not sure that ecosystem services by themselves head people in that direction, but I think that's something else we need to do. There's lots of examples I could give, but maybe one that might be interesting. Back in 1996, actually, we did a study in South Africa about the Fynbos ecosystems, which is a very unique ecosystem in the southern Cape. And the way we approached that was to get a group of stakeholders together to build a simulation model of how those systems functioned. That included not only the hydrology and the vegetation and the fire dynamics, but also the production of various ecosystem services: water, wildflowers, ecotourism, biodiversity, etc. The advantage of that is that you get a diverse group together. Instead of focusing on negotiating their interests, you get them focused on building a model to try to understand the dynamics of this complex system. And that sort of takes them out of their comfort zone, at the same time I think allows a much deeper level of consensus building to go on about what's happening there. The parks managers, the issue there was, how much effort should they put into clearing, invasive European pine species that would allow the fynbos to sort of recover and produce all of these services. And the model was built in a way that sort of allowed some some primitive gaming kind of approach. You could adjust the values you attributed to these systems, other uncertainties. You could play with different sliders in the model, and you could see by doing that that no matter what you did, the value of those services far outweighed the cost of doing the clearing. That led to a continuing program now to employ the local population to do the clearing of the pine forests, and it's been a very successful program that I think would not have happened really well. It might have happened, but maybe more slowly and with less sort of buy-in if we hadn't sort of pointed out all of these very complex connections, and many of which you wouldn't necessarily see without understanding the underlying system. So I think going forward with this concept, what's next? I think more of that kind of thing to me would be on the table. And Ida mentioned this idea that we had of creating computer games around ecosystem services that would not only allow those complex dynamics to occur, but allow people to begin to educate themselves about how those systems work, by playing the game. They're not going to read scientific papers. They're not going to come to conferences like this. But if you can get people to interact with the system at that sort of game level, they can begin to understand what you're talking about, and I think appreciate it more.
Yeah, Bruce, do you have an example from the consultation?
Sorry if I'm not being concise.
So I'll come at this from my experiences with the World Forum on Natural Capital. I think a real success of the language around natural capital ecosystem services has been the Natural Capital Protocol, which Ada alluded to there. It's a kind of broadly a how-to guide for business, how to implement the natural capital approach through their business. And ecosystem services is obviously key to that. That includes things like the Kering Puma environmental profit and loss account, and it's recently just had Hugo Boss sign up to it. It has numerous multinationals around the world signed up and looking at their impacts and dependencies on natural capital. So I think that's been a real success of the language. Where I think it falls down for me slightly at the moment is maybe a failure of people in my position, making this relatable to people on the ground. Small, medium-sized enterprises in Scotland make up a huge part of the economy, and I think we're a long way off making this relevant to them day to day. We're trying at the moment, but I think we've got work to do there. And looking around how technical we make that language and how relevant we make that to them is very important. I suppose I'm a glass half full kind of person, because even these failures in some areas, it's still got people talking about their impacts and dependencies on the natural world, which I view as a good thing, and it's got it further up the agenda. So I think that's mainly positive from my perspective.
So at that point, can I ask Scott to ask his question?
Read my phone. Hi, I'm Scott Matheson from CEPA, colleague of Becky's. And having heard your talk, Bob, I suspect I know what the answer is in relation to plurality of approaches, but terminology ought not to matter as much as it seems to. But, I say but again, the emphasis in the business community seems to be moving towards use of the related concept of natural capital. And we have feedback in CEPA from some companies that they're uncomfortable with the terminology of ecosystem services. So, should we be using the language of natural capital rather than ecosystem services in our dealings with businesses that we regulate and that we wish to influence? Does it really matter?
Let's talk about enabling.
Well, that's obviously not an either-or question, or at least it shouldn't be. Natural capital is what contributes to producing ecosystem services, and so. I mean, you could argue there are several synonyms that you could use for any of these, and it is a communication tool. So I would argue for using whatever terms seem to communicate best with your audience. But I think the distinction between the stock and the flow, the stock of capital and the flow of services, is one that also needs to be incorporated. It's not an either. It's definitely not an either or. You want to mention that?
Sure. Just talking from a business perspective, we're working on a big project with the National Australian Bank, and they have a tendency to use natural capital to certain people, and yet they do use ecosystem services to a lot of their stakeholders. So they've had big conferences on ecosystem services with their stakeholders as well. And the project we're doing with them is they're starting with farmers, basically. And what they're trying to do is have their farmers manage natural capital environment, their farms better through providing financial incentives. So the way they're doing it is, if let's say a farmer is not degrading their soil, maintaining their soil, keeping the water quality up, etc., their interest rates will be really low. If the farmer is overgrazing or over-fertilizing, totally reducing the water quality, etc., their interest rates will be really high. They might not even be able to get a loan. And the bank is doing that for right or wrong reasons. They're doing it to mitigate their own risk. So in Australia, where they're based, there isn't agricultural insurance. And so the banks provide the insurance for the farmers. So on a good year where there's a good amount of sun, average amount of water, all the farmers do pretty equally. However, when there's floods or a drought, which Australia gets all the time, the farmers that are degrading their land, they basically foreclose on the farms. They can't make their bills. And the bank has to then back them up. The farmers that don't degrade their natural capital do okay. And so this is, for the bank, a way to mitigate financial risk by incorporating natural capital into their accounts and into their calculations. And so when they talk to the farmers, some farmers understand ecosystem services, some understand natural capital, some don't understand either. But they understand the concept and understand how the land works. And I think the concept is more important, whatever terms you use. So. Yep.
I mean, having said that, it's neither one or the other, and ecosystem services obviously flow from natural capital. I think that possibly natural capital is slightly more useful if you want to link it to some kind of accountancy framework, especially at the national scale, or also at the national scale. And so if we want to have an idea whether we are actually doing well as a nation or not so well, perhaps incorporating the natural capital into some sort of measure, it is something that can be done probably more easily than looking at ecosystem services, and so having some kind of genuine progress index and so on and so forth. Probably natural capital is a concept that is more easily understood and incorporated.
Okay, so that.
Wait, but keep in mind that the World Bank, when they're working with countries to incorporate natural capital accounts, they're using the concept of ecosystem services to do it through, because ecosystem services are the flow, and a lot of national accounts do incorporate the flow of whatever's going on in the financial system. So that's where the ecosystem services come in.
But it's not either or.
It's not. It's never either or.
It's a matter of communication. This discussion about where it could be applied leads us nicely into the mainstreaming set of questions. I'd like to ask Sally Thomas to ask her question first, because I know you have to leave a bit earlier.
Thank you, Sally Thomas, Scottish Government. Thanks very much for the presentations. If I can just preface the question, just having heard the presentations, I think a couple of the speakers referred to a view that the concept is kind of spreading out more broadly into different areas. Becky spoke about desire to get in amongst the heads of business and boardrooms, perhaps implying that it's not spreading maybe as broadly as some would like. Speaking from a policy perspective, I find it's as a concept, whether ecosystem services or natural capital, which I think are two slightly different things, and perhaps we're in danger of using them interchangeably tonight. In policy terms, it's actually very difficult to get the concept across, to get it picked up, to get it integrated into policy in a meaningful way. So my question really was, how do we make ecosystem services a meaningful concept in a much broader range of areas than currently? Because I think there's a risk that we spend our time preaching to the converted.
Thanks, Sally. I agree with you, but I think that we need to stop talking about ecosystem services and natural capital and really use, well, I mean, you know, to be honest, in academic audiences it's great, and it's a great tool for thinking comprehensively about flows of benefits from the environment. But I really think that with the audiences that we want to change the behaviour of, so businesses businesses, the general public, I don't think that the language is right, and I think we need to talk their language rather than them try and persuade them to talk ours.
What's their language?
Well, their language is benefits from the environment. What benefits do you get from the environment?
Well,
What do you?
That's the definition of ecosystem
Well,
services.
yeah, but it's a different. It's not saying what ecosystem services do you enjoy. It's saying how does the environment benefit you? I mean, it's just purely a language thing.
I agree. I think it is very important, the sort of language that you use, and we have to be really careful we don't turn people off at an early stage, because I think if once you've lost a group of stakeholders, it can be very difficult to re-engage them on an issue. There's a gentleman in the back there, Mike Helm, who runs the Scottish Forum on Natural Capital. He ran a business event last week for at the Institute of Directors in Scotland for a range of businesses, and he sneakily called it resilience in business. Because that's the word that he picked up on. It's very popular in the kind of business environment in Scotland at the moment. In actual fact, we had a discussion about the natural capital protocol and what that could do for businesses in Scotland. But I think it's trying to suck and see what works with audiences, and sometimes we don't get it quite right. And I think we're trying hard to evolve the language to use it. But it all comes back to the core element being based on ecosystem services. I mean, Rebecca's saying they don't use ecosystem services explicitly within SEPA anymore, but you know, it's the concepts still kind of remain at the base of it.
Do we really think it's just about the language, or is it our ability to put over the concept regardless of the language that we're using? It's very easy for us to say, well, it's all about the language. If we just use different words, everybody would get it and understand it. I kind of feel that's a little bit of a get out for those within the profession to say it's all about the language. I think it's a bit deeper than that. There is vocabulary that joins our language every day of the week, you know, and I could give you examples of words that have joined our vocabulary in the last 5 years, and everybody will know what they mean because they use them, because they understand them. And I think it's more about helping that understanding of the concept regardless of the words that we use. And that's really kind of the heart of the question, is how do we get that concept over regardless of the words that we're using?
I'll just very quickly say we've found getting champions with individual sectors and business enormously helpful for that, getting people that will help take it forward, and maybe that's where we've got to begin finding the champions in each sector, and that's what we've found helpful with the Scottish Forum so far.
Paul, I think we wanted to...
Well, I think this partly gets back to my first point about the argument culture, that we tend to try to oversimplify what is really a very complex phenomena. And I think that by the term ecosystem, was originally coined really to recognize that this is not just a passive bunch of resources out there that we can harvest. That it's a complex system, and that's what's providing the benefits and the services. So I think it's what we need to do is really to convince these audiences that these systems are not simple, they're complicated, and we have to take that on board and take it into account. And if you succumb to the pressure to sort of oversimplify these ideas into something that's black and white and easy to make a decision about, then I think we're not really fulfilling the essence of what this concept is about, and that we have to look at the whole system. We can't just look at one piece at a time.
Just sort of building on that, really sort of what Rebecca said, where SEPA's failure was overcomplicating the decision and it doesn't make a better decision at the end of it, and the existing process is reasonably well. I think that's exactly where business are. So, it needs to add value, it needs to deliver something. It can't, so at the moment, a lot of our companies make decisions and investment and they kind of say the word, well, we're just doing the right thing. We know this needs to be done, and it's not got the kind of the detail behind it, but they know that investment in that renewable energy is what we need to do for the the globe, because we can't keep using finite resources. So it's just making those sensible business decisions and doing the right thing, but we just don't have a simple process to put it into the words yet, and it's very, from our perspective, it's still very overcomplicated and doesn't actually add anything.
So that actually segues quite nicely into Tom's question, who's not focusing on a business perspective, but on the land managers.
How can environmental practitioners determine if using payments for ecosystem services is an appropriate policy tool for their needs?
Well, they obviously have to hire some very expensive consultants and tell them the answer to that very complicated question. It depends. I think that's something that depends on the manager. But I think what needs to happen is for better, more easily accessible tools out there to be able to communicate what's going on the land, but in a way that isn't so expensive, but still captures the complexity of the system. So I was mentioning the computer modeling kind of approach, and we have available to us these days, so much more data, so much more computer power, so much more knowledge about how these complex systems function, that I think that the challenge is really getting that into a form that's both credible and reliable, but also not expensive to apply. So that Ida was mentioning the project with the National Australia Bank, and what we're doing for them is something like that, a computer model that could be applied to almost any farm anywhere, that would assess both the dynamics of the system and how that connects with people's well-being and what the ecosystem services are, but that doesn't require a big study each time you do it, or expensive consultants to come in. Something they could use to assess the natural capital on the farms, but also the farmers could use to help do that themselves and understand what would improve their functioning and their value. So I don't know if that answered the question or not.
Yeah, I'm slightly worried that I'm going to disagree here with Paul Costanza, but I'm kind of in relation to PES schemes and payments for ecosystem services. I think we actually do need to simplify quite big time, and we need to focus on very clear ecosystem services that we can clearly attribute to that we can associate with particular buyers and particular sellers. And so I think that where people are doing schemes that are clearly related to carbon sequestration, so woodland planting, peatland restoration, we have got clear mechanisms at the moment, but I think that establishing effective payment for ecosystem services mechanisms does depend upon having clear buyers and sellers and a clear way of describing the product that buyers actually want to buy, and that's why I want to simplify, but Bob's going to come back now.
Simplify is not the right word, I think.
Well, maybe this is simplifying in a way, because I think that the problem there is trying to force the ecosystem services concept into a market formulation. And in order to do that, you have to have, rival excludable goods. You have to have explicit buyers and sellers. You have to be able to measure exactly what it is you're buying and what you're paying for. And I think that's the wrong approach, because these are public goods. It's produced by the whole ecosystem. It's not like one at a time. And so the idea of a common asset trust is, I think, a more appropriate approach. What worked in Costa Rica, I think, is something that actually ends up being more like that. They're not trying to have the beneficiaries and the producers directly negotiating with each other like a normal market. They have a quasi-government agency called FONAFIFO that acts as the trustee. They collect fees for gasoline usage and water usage and ecotourism fees. And then they pay farmers just the opportunity cost. They pay them how much would it take for you to stop raising cattle and start planting trees. So they're using economic incentives, but it's not a market. It's really a trust. They're acting as the trustee for the system. They're trying to rebuild the natural capital, and they're doing it in the most cost-effective way that they know how. So in a sense, that's a simpler system than trying to force a market onto a system that doesn't really work. And I think that's where these PES systems have failed, because the transaction costs become too high. Even with carbon, I think it's also part of the issue. Like you have additionality, you have all these requirements for trying to make carbon sequestration into a marketable good, when in fact it's really a much more complex phenomena that the whole system is doing, and we need to think of that of acting as trustees for that function, and using economic incentives in the most appropriate way to enhance the functioning of the system.
Bruce, you want to take response to that?
I think where the simplicity comes in, I agree with elements of both of that, is really at the land manager's end. If it's not simple to implement, they will not take the opportunity. And as a land manager, the Scottish Wildlife Trust currently doesn't get any money from our approximation of payment for ecosystem services, the Scottish Rural Development Programme, because it's too much hassle for us to do it. We don't have the resource to draw down on it, and think that us as an NGO that would be looking to deliver those broader public benefits would really be keen to take up that money, because we don't have a lot of it. But that's where the complexity for me is the problem. If the land manager can't access the market, basically, then I don't think it's going to work terribly well.
Chris, can I ask you?
Yep.
Oh, sure.
One more on this.
Just one.
I would just quickly to point out that we also need, for payment for ecosystem services to work, I think we also need to have a clear backstopper in terms of what is a minimum standard that we want to implement. Otherwise, we can end up with perverse incentives where I could set up a business of mitigating pollution, essentially, that I produce in the absurd. So there needs to be a clear understanding of what is a minimum standard to meet before we talk about the efficiency of trading, in my opinion.
Hi, my name is Chris Guest. I'm a carbon management student here at the University of Edinburgh. Building on the idea of ecosystem services as a language and a communication tool, should the principle of ecosystem services, however it's defined, be taught in schools? And if so, who should take responsibility for lobbying for its inclusion in sort of national curricula?
Yeah, well, that would be NGOs, I guess. Yeah, so yeah, that is something we advocate. We advocate in our policy that there should be more holistic environmental learning. I think something like the curriculum for excellence lends itself perfectly to having a combined module where you might study geography, you might study elements of biology and ecology, and you might even throw in some mathematics in there, and business studies perhaps, and come out with kind of holistic modules. The other thing is our higher education as well. I studied at Scottish Agricultural College as it was then. It's now Scottish Rural Universities and Colleges. There's one compulsory environmental module, I believe, still in first year for agrics, which are the principal land managers, the next generation of land managers across Scotland. I really think in our higher education institutions we need to be teaching engineers, farmers, chemists, the whole lot about our dependencies. Let's not call it natural capital, let's call it the environment, because only then will we really sort of mainstream these issues, I feel, and certainly that's something the Scottish Wildlife Trust tries to push through its advocacy work.
I did environmental chemistry.
There's, for especially younger kids, the concept can be taught in different ways. So I have a friend who is trying to get into every country this idea of 1 tree per child, where every child plants 1 tree every year. And they go on, and there's a whole sort of curriculum that goes with that planting. So they actually go on, that they named the tree, and it's a whole process. And the curriculum they provide with that is meant for anywhere from like a 5-year-old to a 10-year-old or up. So there's different ways of incorporating that into the curriculum at a younger age without using the terms ecosystem services, natural capital, etc. And games, that's a great way to educate, because every
You
kid
need the
plays it.
Pokemon Go of ecosystem services. That would be the trick. But I think in general, I think we need a much more of a systems education, starting at a very early age, to recognize that the world is not just a bunch of pieces that don't fit together, that in fact it all interacts, everything's connected, we've forgotten that. And so I think if we could reestablish that, and I think that's what the ecosystem services concept is all about, but it's also one of many systems concepts that we could re-educate people about.
And for our last question, I'd like to ask Kirsty to ask her final question.
Thank you. Chair's prerogative, isn't it? So I was asking the panel if they could reflect on the most relevant or most appropriate policy intervention that might help us realise the vision from the Antwerp Declaration. Can't say that. You know what I'm saying. Just to remind you, the Declaration is about trying to use the ecosystem service framework for a transformative outcome, bringing our attention back to sustainability, bringing our attention back to the idea of value, not just commodities, but value in its broadest sense, and the need for collaboration. So what one thing could be done to make that happen? Sorry, it's probably not one thing, is it?
Probably not.
Yeah. Well, briefly, a natural capital wealth fund for me would be the one thing that I'd like to work towards, which is kind of building on Bob's idea of this sort of fund that everyone pays into if you're having an impact on the environment, natural capital, and that goes to paying for basically solutions, investing in natural capital again.
I suppose this is each of us in turn, is it? I want to agree with Bruce, really, and this isn't SEPA's point of view, this is me speaking personally. If I was speaking as SEPA, I'd probably say our latest new statutory purpose is pretty good. It's talking about economic, social, environmental alongside each other. The guidance mentions ecosystem services in it, so it's pretty good. But thinking really about proper change, I think Bruce's idea is a great one.
God, it seems to be. So I was just going to say the changes in SEPA, mainly because just in terms of the Scotch whisky industry are working very closely with SEPA, and the way that they're changing their way they regulate businesses and looking at the decision to be more flexible. So an example would be, instead of just looking at the end of the pipe, to sort of think of the whole system. So don't keep putting tighter and tighter standards on the end of the pipe if the capacity for the water environment is able to deal with those chemicals and pollutants, because all the energy and cement and chemicals, etc., which go into reducing that standard by that small amount is probably not in balance with the resources needed to, or the benefits you'll get from delivering that standard. So it's that new way of thinking that I think is good.
I think I would say the common asset trust and that idea, as it does look at sort of the whole system, and a lot of people know the idea of trust already from the financial sector, and so I think that communicating that and what it means would also be a lot simpler.
More participation and deliberation in decision making, possibly new institution to do that, so that we can take into account both the strictly economic values and also the kind of wider societal values in decision making, both about environment and also all the rest that concerns our well-being.
I agree with that, but I'm going to go along with Bruce and Ida.
I'll
The
take
common asset trust, which I think can be a vehicle for allowing and encouraging more participation in how we manage these common assets. The state of Vermont has a legislation pending now to create what's called the Vermont Common Asset Trust. So to actually implement these ideas, we have, as I said, proposed an atmospheric trust. And if you go online and look at claimthesky.org, there's an open letter to the V20 countries. So we're trying to get the vulnerable 20 countries, led by Costa Rica, to establish this atmospheric trust, which could then act as an institutional framework to accept payments for damages, but also to use those funds to restore and protect the asset. But I think that idea could be used at many different scales, from watersheds up to whole states and countries, and to the global scale. But the big commons that are still out there as open access resources are the atmosphere and the oceans, and so that would be a good place to start.
Great, thank you very much. On that note, we'll end the Q&A session and continue discussions over wine. I'd like to thank our panel very much for their very good contributions tonight.